Next from Springfield, we attend a press conference where Representative Lou Lang and Representative John Anthony discuss the details of a bill they're sponsoring that would combat growing heroin and prescription drug abuse in Illinois. This runs about 45 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm State Representative Lou Lang, the Deputy Majority Leader of the Illinois House of Representatives. I'm joined today by my colleagues John Cabello and John Anthony, and former Representative Dennis Rebelletti, who was here today. He would tell you in the role of Citizen Rebelletti. Several months ago, in fact, April of 2014, I asked the Speaker of the House to create a task force to study the problems we're having in our state on the issue of heroin and opioid addiction. It's a serious and geometrically increasing problem in our state, as it is across every state in America. Lots of states have tried to rein in this problem with small measures. Some have worked in a little bit of a small way. But the goal of the task force was to listen to testimony from anyone that wanted to come to us to discuss issues with us regarding what to do about making a dent in this problem. We did not spend a lot of time having relatives of those who unfortunately perished at the hands of heroin come to us. We know the stories. We heard from coroners. We heard from lots of people in law enforcement. We heard from people in the judicial community. We heard from providers. We heard from all sorts of people. The task force had 39 members, which is a huge task force in the General Assembly. 1/3 of the House of Representatives, people from both sides of the aisle, volunteered to be on this task force. And we spent many months traveling the state. The fact that so many of our House members were committed to this task force tells you how serious the problem is in Illinois. This is a problem that used to be thought of as a suburban problem or a rich person's problem. But what we discovered during the hearings at the task force was that it is no longer that, if it ever was that. Heroin is now far more potent than it ever was and far cheaper than it ever was. In fact, you can get high on heroin today in our state and in any state in this country for $5. Heroin is now cheaper than marijuana to purchase. And in fact, we learned during these hearings that for many, one experience with heroin can hook them. One single experience can hook them and lead them to their own death, their own demise, the destruction of their families, etc. So we listened to a lot of testimony and spent a good deal of time drafting legislation. Legislation was filed in the last half hour. It is an amendment to House Bill 1. I believe it's 242 pages long. The reason I tell you that is that we didn't want to do small measures here in Illinois. We wanted to file a bill that was comprehensive, that dealt with as many of the aspects of heroin abuse and other drug addiction as we possibly could. This is a bill that not everyone will like, not because they don't think it will help with the problem, but because it does a lot of pushing on a lot of folks. Some in law enforcement won't appreciate it. Some in the education community won't appreciate it. Many in the insurance industry will have a problem with it. Doctors, hospitals will have a problem with parts of the bill. Pharmacies will have a problem with parts of the bill. In short, there will be pushback. But we didn't draft this bill to avoid pushback. In fact, every major thing that's done in this building requires negotiation, requires dedication, creativity. In this case, add some aggressiveness to it. We've made some choices along the way about how we drafted this bill. And our bill that was introduced today by way of the amendment to House Bill 1 is our best shot to do something about this problem in the state of Illinois. The folks standing before you and many others are prepared to do what we must to pass this bill intact. Certainly we will listen to those who have ideas about how to rewrite sections of the bill, and we imagine, all of us, that those conversations will commence maybe as early as this afternoon, now that the bill is out there and people will have a chance to read it. We did our best, but what we know is this. Whether or not this bill passes immediately, whether it passes or not in its current form, whether people are angry about it and don't like parts of the bill, we know that this bill will save lives. We know that this bill will save problems for countless numbers of families in Illinois whose loved ones have died or are addicts today, people who have destroyed their lives, thrown away their careers, ruined their children's futures, all over heroin and other opioid addiction. We want to do something about it. This bill will begin the process of doing exactly that. As I said, it's a very comprehensive bill going into a lot of areas, but I do want to spend a few minutes describing some of these issues, at least briefly, so you know the different directions we are going. First, it's very clear that there's a direct link between overprescribing of prescription pharmaceuticals and heroin addiction and other drug abuse. Many of you have been in a situation yourselves where, let's say you have a tooth pulled, and the doctor gives you, the dentist gives you, or the oral surgeon gives you a prescription for perhaps 30 Vicodin to deal with the pain that you might have from that pulled tooth, and you might take 3 of those. Maybe you take 4 of those. The other 26 or 27 sit in your medicine cabinet for people to steal from you, or for you to go back to when you have knee pain that was not part of the prescription. Maybe you get it refilled. Maybe you continue to use it. And so there's a direct link between overprescribing and overuse and addiction. And so this bill will require that pharmacies not dispense more than 10 days of a Schedule II controlled substance at one time. The doctor can still prescribe 30. The doctor can still prescribe whatever the doctor feels the patient needs. But the pharmacy must not issue more than 10 at a time unless the doctor certifies in advance that the doctor is willing to go on the line to say this patient is going to need all 30. The patient can get all 30, but must come back to the pharmacy for 10 days at a time. This will avoid extra pills being on people's shelves. This will avoid them getting into their own pills for no reason, or for visitors to their homes getting into these pills. Additionally, on this topic, Illinois, under this bill, would become the first state in the nation to have a mandated prescription return program to every pharmacy in the state of Illinois. We all know that in many communities around the state, police departments and other local government officials will have volunteer days maybe once a year, and they'll announce by putting a sign on a tree trunk somewhere in town that they're taking back unused medication. And sometimes people will bring it back, and sometimes they won't bring it back, and sometimes people will just flush it down the toilet, which is not so good for the environment. But a lot of people don't want to go to the police station for whatever reason they have. We think the pharmacies are the place to take it back. First of all, the pharmacies are the place you buy the medication. Secondly, pharmacies have to dispose of medication every day. Expired medication on their shelves. Federal government has guidelines for them to destroy this medication. And people are in their pharmacies every day and every week, particularly ill people, particularly senior citizens. And so we want to get extra medication out of the pipeline. The way to do that is to have the first in the nation prescription give-back program to the pharmacies. People don't get their money back, but they're able to dispose of unused and unwanted medication. It also requires the PMP to issue a report to prescribers informing them of potential medication shopping when a person is identified as having 3 or more prescribers or 3 or more pharmacies within a 30-day period. Currently, it's 6 or more. This will, again, provide more input, more information, and maybe give a doctor an extra thought about whether they would prescribe something to a patient who has continuously been at pharmacies filling prescriptions that that doctor did not provide in the first place. It requires the Department of Financial and Professional Regulation to adopt rules regarding the oversight of prescriber practices in this regard, and requires all new prescribers to register to access the PMP as a condition of obtaining or renewing a license to prescribe controlled substances. Physician education. It surprised all of us to learn that there is no mandated program for physicians in med school or in continuing medical education after a physician is licensed on the issue of drug addiction. We thought long and hard about whether we would mandate that med schools teach drug addiction, and we decided against that. But we did decide that the Department of Professional Regulation should adopt rules to require prescribers within their continuing medical education classes post-license that they take classes in the area of drug addiction and the abuse of controlled substances. These would not be additional hours. Today, they're required to take 50 hours of education per license year. We would just say that there need to be some classes in drug abuse within that 30 hours. Today, there are no regulations in the law of the state of Illinois regarding pain clinics. Pain clinics have popped up all over the state of Illinois. The bill would require IDFPR to adopt rules for the registration and licensing of pain clinics. The issue of a product called naloxone or Narcan. Many don't know this, but if somebody's in the middle of a heroin overdose, a product called Narcan or naloxone will reverse that crisis by an injection. It's an antidote that works, but it's not an antidote that everybody has. So the bill would do several things. First, it would require first responders, fire departments, police departments to have this product available at all times. Second, it would allow for the director of the Department of Public Health to write a standing order for anyone who is properly trained to have Narcan or naloxone in the case of a situation where they have a loved one or significant other who might be hooked on drugs, so that they have the product available to them for that particular person. Today, under the law, we have a program, but this would strengthen the program and would allow for a standing order so that if your husband, your wife, your roommate, your significant other was, or your child, was having problems getting off of opioids, that you would be able to have Narcan available to you for use in the case of an emergency. The bill would require Department of Human Services and the State Board of Education to develop a 3-year heroin and opioid drug prevention pilot program, which would be voluntary for all public and elementary schools in the state. There are organizations out there, particularly the Robert Crown Center, where we met for many hours one day, that has a wonderful program. Not simply the old-style program where we were telling children, just say no, which didn't work, but a real program with good software that is adaptable to each grade level to teach children about the evils of drugs. The state, of course, would pay for this program. It allows a school district to authorize a school nurse to administer an opioid antidote if necessary. As we know, when people are hooked, they may get hooked anywhere, at home, at work, and of course at school. We want school nurses, after undergoing training, to be able to deal with this issue. Insurance coverage. It's clear that we have insufficient insurance coverage in the state of Illinois for these issues. And we have a haphazard set of rules regarding the way insurance coverage works for these folks. So many insurance companies, for instance, will provide someone 14 days of coverage for treatment for drug addiction, particularly opioid addiction. It's very clear that 14 isn't enough. This bill would say that it's not the insurance companies that decide how much is enough, it's the doctor in conjunction with the patient. And, of course, much of the time, the issue of drug abuse and drug addiction is intertwined with mental health issues. And so this law would deeply go into the understanding of the relationship between the mental health parity laws that we've passed here in Springfield and the ones that have been passed in Washington, and an understanding that insurance carriers, where mental health is involved, must do better in treatment of patients, and it gives the department all the tools it needs to enforce such laws, mental health parity laws, as well as laws that would specify that insurance carriers must give patients what they need. The issue of Medicaid. Much of the things we have talked about here, many of the things we have talked about here are not covered by Medicaid. Naloxone is not covered by Medicaid. Drug treatment, often not covered by Medicaid. Methadone, not covered by Medicaid. Other things not covered by Medicaid. We can't have a law that simply says, well, if you have the wherewithal to pay for your insurance and you're a working person and you happen to be hooked, these laws will take care of you. But if you're poor and can't afford insurance and can't afford to take care of yourself, you're out of luck. And so it goes hand in hand with our desire to help all the people of the state of Illinois with these issues, that we would require Medicaid to pay for these services. Finally, in the area of drug courts, this is a very critical area. Drug courts are a part of the law of the state of Illinois today, but many counties have weak drug courts. Many counties don't really use their drug courts. Some have done a very fine job with them. This comes from a law enforcement community that often is very conservative, and they take the point of view that if somebody has possession of drugs, whoever they are, they're a criminal, and the place they belong is jail. This bill moves away from the put them in jail approach and moves to the rehab approach. And we do that in many ways. First, we strengthen drug courts by providing training to drug court judges and to prosecutors and to everyone else in the pipeline that has something to do with a particular defendant. Next, it removes the prohibition on multiple drug court appearances, and by that I mean this. The law says today, one strike and you're out. And so if there's a decision made to put an individual in drug court rather than put them in the criminal justice system directly and maybe send them to jail where they won't get the rehab they need and they come out just as hooked as they were when they went in. But the law says one strike and you're out. In other words, if you go to drug court and you are recidivist, you're going right back to the criminal justice system and probably to jail. One time is not enough. Clearly, there are a whole wide array of people who are recidivists. It's tough to get off this stuff. And so one isn't enough, and so this bill would say the prosecutor can't stop it for the first 3 times, and after that, the prosecutor and the judge together can talk about whether a particular defendant in one of these cases deserves another shot at drug court. But at least we will give these people an opportunity to get better. The goal here is not to fill up our prisons with people who are going to come out and go right back to prison because they haven't been properly treated. Drug courts, when properly used, will save lives. They will treat people, and they'll keep people out of jail and give them the treatment and the help they need to stay off the stuff. These are the major provisions of the bill. I'm quite sure I've missed some, but as I said, you can tell from these provisions that there will be some pushback. All of us here are prepared to deal with that pushback. Everyone here has worked very hard to put this together. I want to thank all the gentlemen standing behind me, and additionally, Representative Sam Yingling, who had a separate task force on the issue of youth and heroin, They did amazing work, and their report is out, and virtually everything in that report is in this report with some stronger measures. And so Representative Yingling joins in what we're doing here today. I'd also, before I leave the podium, want to thank our staff who did a fine and amazing job putting this together, staff on both the House Democratic and House Republican side. And so I think it's appropriate we hear from everybody here before we take your questions. So let me introduce Representative John Anthony.
Thank you, Leader. Good afternoon. My name is John Anthony. I'm the state representative from the 75th District. One of the reasons I quickly jumped onto this bill and to this task force is that as a former Kendall County Sheriff's Deputy and a Champaign City police officer, I tended to see this problem up close and personal. I'll never forget the first time that I responded to an overdose call. I can't use the name because the person was a juvenile, but I'll never forget showing up to this place and seeing the color purple. That was the color of this individual. And I didn't know what to do. There's no training. We were never prepared to deal with those individuals who are on overdosing, I should say. And so we came in and we got them back to life. And it's also a personal issue for me. I'm from Chicago, and my mom was an addict. A lot of my close friends and family members, and I've seen how this drug destroys people. And as I relate it to the leader, I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that this bill gets passed. I'm sure there are a lot of issues with this bill, and Representative Cabello, whose district is really hampered by it, and I'll let him go into the details of that, as well as former Representative Dennis Revelletti, who has seen this issue up close. I actually have a state's attorney in my district who is implementing the mental health and the drug court. His name is Jason Helen. He's a state's attorney from Grundy County. You know, in short, this plan is a great example of what Democrats and Republicans can accomplish when we work together. Our plan is bold, it's comprehensive, but I do believe it's achievable. And I look forward to getting this bill passed in the House, and I'll be open for any questions. And I'll be introducing State Representative John Cabello.
I'll be brief as I can. Winnebago County is where I'm from. Last year, the City of Rockford Fire Department transported 210 people that did not die from a heroin overdose, thanks to Narcan. We had over 100 people die of overdose in our county, with, I believe, 41 strictly due to heroin. This is a county of less than 350,000 people. When we look at what we have to do, the measures in this are going to be a little controversial to some folks. But when we realize that lives are more important, when we look at the drug court aspect, some people are going to need more than one time. And if we are going to look at trying to solve the problem, then we need to look at all of the solutions, and I believe a lot of those solutions are in this bill. We have a very good drug court in Winnebago County, along with a RIC center. I would be more than welcome to set you up with anybody that you would like to talk to. But the things that are in this bill are going to help even more. So we have to work together. Thanks to Leader Lang and the leaders on our side of the aisle are understanding that we have to come to a resolution to this because too many people are dying. So congratulations. I look forward to helping with it. And I'm still going to call him Representative Revelletti because he'll always be a representative to me.
Thank you, John. I don't have a district at this time, ladies and gentlemen, but I think most of you know who I am. My name is Dennis Revelletti. I'm a resident of this great state, and I've lived in Elmhurst all my life. which is I would consider one of the communities that has been ground zero in this state for communities that have been impacted by the scourge of heroin. DuPage County has been ground zero. I thought that this issue was simply a suburban issue until I joined this task force. And I'm somebody who's dealt with narcotics prosecutions since 2004 at Will County. And I think I've evolved on this issue as somebody who's worked in drug courts, who's prosecuted drug dealers of large sizes, who's worked in task forces with the FBI and DEA, and who's also gone on search warrants with task forces. But I can tell you that as a parent of a 13-year-old, it's pretty scary when you see what is happening at middle schools and at high schools and at schools all throughout, that young people are getting hooked on prescription medication. That's the major driver. That they turn to heroin once the opioids are gone, and that, as the Robert Crown program that Leader Lang talked about shows, in an interactive fashion, how somebody who has a bright future with good grades and a good family ends up dead. I've been to too many wakes already of people who've passed from heroin that I have known. I've seen people in drug court die. And the time is now to act. The leader talked about all the things that are in this bill, and we could probably talk about this for another 2 hours without getting to all of the particulars. But let me cover a couple of other things that were not covered. This mandates coroners to, requires them to put out all the information of every overdose so that we know how many deaths from all narcotics occur in the state. And I also like to believe this bill is not only about heroin, but about addiction and the way we treat addiction overall. Because this not only impacts people who use heroin, people who use alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamines. This is going to touch all of those equally across the board. The other thing is to require hospitals to tell us how many overdoses come through their doors every year. Because that's the major untold story. We hear the stories all across the state about those who've passed, and those are tragic situations. What we don't hear about are the thousands that are saved that we have no idea about. We're starting to learn more about some of those folks because deaths are actually down in DuPage County because officers have been able to respond with Narcan and to revive them. But we don't know what happens to those folks after they're saved. And that's why the treatment component is so important, why the 21 days mandatory before an insurance company can begin to try to challenge the doctor's diagnosis is so crucial. During our task force, we learned in dealing with a halfway house, which many heroin addicts and many addicts have to go to, which is a transitional housing with treatment, that most of the times that was deemed not medically necessary. If I was an outpatient, my services would be covered. If I lived there in the bricks and mortar, it was not. We also see insurance companies denying treatment when it's not considered medically necessary after the person has an overdose and then detoxes, because now they are not homicidal, they're not suicidal, they're no longer a danger to themselves on day 3 or day 4 when they leave a detox setting. There's also another part of the bill which is near and dear to my heart. After having worked on the RICO bill with these gentlemen back here a couple of years ago, we passed a statewide RICO bill, which is similar to what the federal government uses to attack drug kingpins, the gang members, to get to the top of the pyramid. What this allows the state's attorneys to do, and DuPage has prosecuted one, Lake County, I think, has just indicted a group. I know Cook County has, and I think they may have indicted the second group, is to allow during that prosecution to seize all of the assets that were found to be part of the criminal enterprise that the gang used. And one of the frustrating things as a prosecutor is to watch the condos and the cars and all of the money that cannot be traced all the way back to girlfriends and cousins and neighbors. So we want to use this law to track all that money, to take the profit out, to attack those that are doing harm directly. And it will be the goal of the bill is to take that money and put it back into the treatment portion and the educational portion here. I want to thank Leader Lang in particular. When I sat with him, I've sat on a number of task forces. I think all of you are pretty aware of that. If it had criminal justice in it, I sat there. Sometimes just sat there. And we have task forces sometimes that just meet. There is no conclusion. There's a report. There's no active legislation following that particular event. Leader Lang told me as soon as I walked in the room with him, he said, I hope you're prepared to do something big. I think that this is the most comprehensive bill in the nation. It's big, it's bold, and I think it will become the standard bearer for what other states that are facing this crisis will begin to follow. The nation will have its eyes on this state, and I believe that 91 people need to be involved to pass this, 60 in the House, 30 in the Senate, and we need the governor to change the way that we address addiction in this state, and I think nationally. So thank you all for allowing me to be here.
Thank you. I think it's telling that Democrats and Republicans work together on this bill. I think it's also telling that the gentlemen standing here with me have all been involved in law enforcement in their other lives. Mr. Rebelletti was a state's attorney. Mr. Cabello and Mr. Anthony, both police officers. They have seen what heroin and what drug addiction does in the communities of Illinois. And so I thank them wholeheartedly for their involvement and for their desire to help move this to the finish line, and with their help we will. So we thank you all for being here. We'd be happy to take some questions.
Lou, what $25 million price tag on this, where would that money go, and who generated that as a cost of the bill?
The $25 million in the bill we filed was an estimate and only an estimate. It could be 20, it could be 30. But somebody needs to remember that there's a cost of not doing anything. The cost of not doing anything around the state of Illinois is untold millions of dollars, untold destruction to families. I don't have a special pot of money for this $25 million, if that's what the number is, but I do know that we're in the middle of a budget process. And if members of the General Assembly and the governor agree that this is a bill, a program to save citizens of Illinois from destruction that we must pass, then we'll have to find the money to do it. No program that's this important should be left languishing simply because it has a price tag. We will have to find the money for it.
The money to go to the drug courts, or where?
The money goes to all kinds of places, drug courts, Narcan for the police officers, improving the line item for addiction services, which has been cut close to 50% or more in the last several years. I noted that in the governor's budget address, he was actually talking about cutting further services for heroin overdoses and heroin abuse. I'm going to have a conversation with him about that. We can't possibly fix this problem without money. Some of the things in this bill we can. Some of these things don't cost the state of Illinois any money. And we'll pursue those, but we're going to need to do some things and spend a little money to save the lives of our citizens. We owe them that.
Is this an indictment of the DEA of not doing their job? Why the explosion of cheap heroin, and to what extent do you know, is this tied to our porous border on the southern with Mexico?
Maybe Mr. Rebelletti has a comment on this.
I think that open borders have been an issue with that. 1 in 10 trucks that travel across the southern border have drugs in them. So we're talking about major numbers. We actually met with the DEA. So we left no stone uncovered and talked to them about what we should be doing. They thought that the RICO provision was very important for the local people. They're well aware of, look, Chicago is the nation's hub. It's our transportation hub. So the same way goods find their way here, we are basically the central depository for heroin, and it makes its way out everywhere else. So there's issues that the federal government needs to address. They have their own financial problems, but obviously allowing cartels to move. There's tens of thousands of people that die south of the border over these wars. There's thousands of untold casualties there. But I think the state can only do so much from the law enforcement perspective. Their budgets are taxed. no different than the federal government's budget being taxed as well. But I think border security would be helpful. But the fact of the matter is it's getting here. And so therefore we have to address it. I think this is a pretty fresh approach to dealing with it. Sure.
And one more question. There's the issue of use, of availability, and it's become cheap, and that's one reason it's spread. There's the issue of interdiction of the drugs coming in. Do they have to go together, or how really are you going to fight this? How are you going to stop the use of cheap heroin, no matter what you do, if it's always available?
I think that at some point you realize that that's why you have so many prongs of this bill. You're dealing with education on the front end with young people. You're dealing with drug courts when they're in the criminal justice system. You also have the insurance companies are in the middle, and the doctors and everybody at pharmacies, because there are people who have issues that can address them before they get to the criminal justice system. Why is heroin so cheap now? Well, part of it is, believe it or not, the legalization of marijuana. So when you see in Colorado, Washington, and in D.C., the farmers elsewhere that move in, the cartels, find it cheaper and more productive to move heroin. It's also processed differently, and it's much more potent, so you don't need to use as much. So it's changed the game. I've heard at one of the hearings that this is not your father's heroin anymore. This is not Vietnam-era heroin. It's also considered chic and trendy, and people think, especially young people, that if they ingest it, sniffing it, that it really can't hurt them that much, versus if they had to put a syringe in, I don't think many people would be interested in trying it that way.
And then to be clear, are there any increases in penalties for users or anything as part of this?
No, we haven't done that. And so the whole point of this is that we want to move away from calling this a crime. Obviously, it's a crime under the laws of the state of Illinois, and we're not going to say it's not a crime. But we want to move away from the criminal model of how to deal with addicts and how to deal with drug addiction to a rehab model. Today, a lot of people go to jail for being in possession and for being users that, if they got rehab, would never go back to jail. Some go to jail and come out and they're still addicts because they're not getting the rehabilitation they need while they're in jail. And so it just exacerbates the problem. It makes it worse, and it becomes a big circular problem, which is costing us more and more and more money that can't be counted by the way we do this.
And then are there penalties for doctors or pharmacies that don't comply? Is that part of it, or is it more of a may versus shall sort of thing?
We haven't put specific penalties in for doctors and pharmacies, but we hope that the bill, the way it's written, will make it very uncomfortable for them not to do what they're supposed to do. And the state agencies will be monitoring whether the pharmacies and doctors are doing what they ought to be doing. And so if they aren't, we can always come back and pass a bill to put more teeth into it.
And then finally, are there any dangers with the antidotes at all, with those being widely available and in people's bathroom cabinets and such? Are those dangerous?
I don't think we heard any testimony at all about side effects from those products. I think we only heard that these have positive outcomes for people. And so some would say that if you make this more available, if you make Narcan more available, then somehow it's going to tell people who are using, well, keep using. There's an antidote available. But that's really kind of a nonsensical argument. Nobody's going to risk their life because they think somebody might come running with Narcan. So I think it's appropriate that we arm people with tools to help their loved ones.
So aside from anecdotal examples, has anyone done a study that we know how much of a growth there is in the use of heroin? And is it a Collier County, is it a Northern Illinois phenomenon, or is it all across?
There are studies which I don't have available to me. Maybe one of the other gentlemen can give more information, but let me say this. What we have heard is that it's an exponentially growing problem around the state of Illinois, and what used to be thought of as a rich person or a suburban problem is now has now been caught up by people downstate. Some who tell me that this has become a worse problem than crystal meth, or other serious drugs that have been available widely around the state of Illinois. And it's no different here than in other states. Because of the purity of heroin now, because of the potency of heroin now and the inexpensive nature of this product, it's a problem building out of control. Does anyone want to add to this?
Back in my district, we've done 2 town hall forums on the heroin epidemic, and that's what it is today. It's an epidemic. And we had over 300 people show up to each event. And there was a guy there by the name of John Roberts. He has an organization called Be a Hero. I believe the website is beahero.com or .org, I don't recall. But I read one study there where it said the increase is 102% increase in heroin usage and overdose. That's a problem. We have to save these lives. I believe that's why we're all up here. And I believe that's why we spent countless hours throughout the summer to try to come up with a comprehensive bill that we can get through the General Assembly and onto the governor's desk.
If I can, just briefly. Please. I can tell you from being in the front line in 2005, that's where I saw much more heroin come into Will County and be the drug of choice over crack cocaine, which had been predominantly the drug of choice that was being moved, sold, and used. I spoke with my state's attorney, Bob Berlin, recently, and I wish I could remember the percentage he told me, but more than a majority of the cases, simple possession cases in DuPage County of possession of a controlled substance, are heroin. In one of the halfway houses in Addison, 80% of the people that are in halfway care treatment are there for heroin, and they're under the age of 25. Most of them are under the age of 21. So that far outweighs, that's showing you real numbers. I don't know if you need a study from University of Chicago to show you that, but I can tell you that from the ground troops will tell you in the different areas that there's no doubt that that is the drug of choice, and that is the issue between the prescription as well as the street version.
We'll take one more question, but I do want to add this. There are some counties doing this well, and we need to stretch that around the state. Will County and DuPage County should both be congratulated for their hard work in this area. They saved a lot of lives. Their drug courts work very well. The state's attorneys and other assistant state's attorneys and law enforcement in those counties have cooperated to make it work. And if we could use those programs as sort of models for the rest of the state, we would save many more lives. We'll take one more question if there is one. Yes, sir.
Obviously, you talked about you're going to have a serious conversation with the governor about this, maybe perhaps Representative Anthony or Cabello. Why is it important for someone from your side of the aisle to maybe kind of echo that sentiment that, you know, this is something you're talking about making cuts. These are cuts you can't make. Why is it important to have that conversation with the governor?
I don't know if that's really that important of a conversation, but I think the statistics show itself. I don't think the governor is going to look at this and say, no, thank you. I don't ever want to speak for the governor, but when we presented this now, a half hour ago, and when it was introduced, now we have things to look at. Now we have what a price tag may be. It's not guaranteed, but it may be. But then again, what price tag do we put on lives? Are we going to start putting a monetary value on people's lives? And I just don't think we should do that. I think after the governor and his staff have the opportunity of looking over this program, I can't see that they would not be on board.
I believe when you look at the governor's intent when it comes to transforming the criminal justice system, I see this fitting right in with that. When you look at who he appointed, John Mackey and Sam Gaddy, I mean, these are people who have been here. They understand the issue. They understand the problem. And I don't, as I'll echo the thoughts of Representative Cabello, I don't want to speak for the governor, but I do believe that this aligns with the whole approach to smart on crime, right on crime approach to changing how we look at criminal justice in the 21st century. So,
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day.